So in terms of how this is being handled in Australia, nothing at all being published at this stage, and what is the plan, or is the way that it would happen, that after the second trial concludes, then the first trial can be reported?
Well, the News Corp publications, specifically the Herald Sun and the Daily Telegraph, are talking about challenging this. They had the Herald Sun had, which is one of the largest tabloids in Australia, had a front page yesterday which was just black on white with the word censored. The Daily Telegraph has talked it up too, about the efficacy of this in the digital age, and also the rights of those who want to know what has happened and have the right to know. The Sydney Morning Herald published a story yesterday which said one of the most important stories of this last decade or so, or at least of our generation, has emerged in Australia, and we're not allowed to report it. Here are the reasons why. So everybody's edging around, they're biting around the edges, but they can't go to the actual substance of it.
And biting around the edges, but to the extent that it would be clear to the reader, perhaps not exactly what has happened, but that it's to do with George Pell or not?
No, not at all, not at all. Because you cannot do that. But for those who are on social media and those who also read online, you put the two together, and obviously you can't go into 1 and 1 equals 2. This is a fascinating subject, just leaving aside the actual conviction for the time being, but the issue of the suppression order and how people get their news these days.
Well, this is the thing. Many people do wake up in the morning, they do perhaps switch on the radio, but they do also maybe check in on the New York Times or the Washington Post. Or
Absolutely.
That's the nature of the world now, isn't it? That we go to the countries that we can go to on their own stories, and then, look, you might get one about your own country while you're there.
Precisely, and even some of the Catholic news outlets have carried this story, and sites such as Beast Online, Radar Online, they've also carried it. So you've got to ask whether or not it's an efficient way to go about things. I mean, clearly there would have been an absolute barrage of media in the mainstream media, or exposure in the mainstream media. But again, Cardinal Pell has been, it's an enormous story with very high impact in Australia. And I do wonder about those who really wish to read about this, who have suffered at the hands of clergy in the Catholic Church for decades, who want to know about George Pell, who want to know that justice, in their eyes, justice has been served. I understand that there could be an appeal, and so those processes will have to be gone through.
And I suppose that serves to keep the whole thing suppressed for longer, if indeed that is the case. So for very few people, they would have been aware that this was actually going on, because we all remember the pictures of some of those the preliminary hearings where he was going into court surrounded by the media and surrounded by lots and lots of people. But the only people who've known that this was going on pretty much would have been the people in the courtroom.
That's right. Well, there was a trial. This is a retrial, and so that was suppressed. And so the whole thing has been shrouded in secrecy.
How do you think this will play with the Australian public when it becomes clear to people, when it's actually reported in the Australian media, about how this is handled?
I think we've got an indication of that in the Sydney Morning Herald editorial yesterday, when they said this is a massive story of great interest to our readers. We've been phoned by people, by our readers, asking why we're not reporting it, and that's the reason that they went to the lengths of explaining why they couldn't. So there's a great deal of interest in Australia about this. And once this is all washed through the legal system, then there will be a pretty vigorous debate about suppression orders, about protection, about concealment, secrecy, etc. I mean, George Pell, just as an aside, not connected to that comment, is a very, very well-connected figure in Australia. He's one of the most famous and controversial figures in the last couple of decades in Australia. He's connected to very powerful figures in the media and in politics, and so this is an incredibly fascinating story.
Thank you very much. Indeed it is. Kerry-Anne Walsh there. Usually she is ending our programme on a Friday when we crossed her in Canberra. Today she's in the Wellington studio. Lovely to talk to you in
Thank you,
person,
Susie.
Kerry-Anne. It's now 22 minutes past 8.